Matthew Henry's Commentary on the Whole Bible. 1 Kings 10. Still Solomon looks great, and everything in this chapter adds to his magnificence. We read nothing indeed of his charity, of no hospitals he built, or almshouses. He made his kingdom so rich that it did not need them, yet, no question, many poor were relieved from the abundance of his table. A church he had built, never to be equaled, schools or colleges he need not build any. His own palace is an academy, and his court a rendezvous of wise and learned men, as well as the center of all the circulating riches of that part of the world. 1. What abundance of wisdom there appears from the application the Queen of Sheba made to him, and the great satisfaction she had in her entertainment there, verses 1 to 13, and others likewise, verse 24. 2. What abundance of wealth there appears here by the gold imported, with other things, yearly, verses 14 and 15, and in a triennial return, verse 22. Gold presented, verse 25, and gold used in targets and shields, verses 16 and 17, and vessels, verse 21. A stately throne made, verses 18 to 20. His chariots and horsemen, verse 26. His trade with Egypt, verses 28 and 29. And the great plenty of silver and cedars among his people, verse 27. So that, putting all together, it must be owned, as it is here said, verse 23, that King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches, and for wisdom. Yet what was he to the King of kings? Where Christ is, by his word and spirit, behold, a greater than Solomon is there. Visit of the Queen of Sheba, 990 BC. 1. And when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. 2. And she came to Jerusalem with a very great train, with camels that bear spices, and very much gold, and precious stones, and when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him of all that was in her heart. 3. And Solomon told her all her questions, there was not anything hid from the king, which he told her not. 4. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all Solomon's wisdom, and the house that he had built, 5. And the meat of his table, and the sitting of his servants, and the attendance of his ministers, and their apparel, and his cupbearers, and his ascent by which he went up unto the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. 6. And she said to the king, it was a true report that I heard in mine own land of thy acts, and of thy wisdom. 7. Howbeit I believed not the words, until I came, and mine eyes had seen it, and, behold, the half was not told me, thy wisdom and prosperity exceedeth the fame which I heard. 8. Happy are thy men, happy are these thy servants, which stand continually before thee, and that hear thy wisdom. 9. Blessed be the Lord thy God, which delighted in thee, to set thee on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever, therefore made he thee king, to do judgment and justice. 10. And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, and of spices very great store, and precious stones. There came no more such abundance of spices as these which the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. 11. And the navy also of Hiram, that brought gold from Ophir, brought in from Ophir great plenty of almug trees and precious stones. 12. And the king made of the almug trees pillars for the house of the Lord, and for the king's house, harps also and psalteries for singers. There came no such almug trees, nor were seen unto this day. 13. And King Solomon gave unto the Queen of Sheba all her desire, whatsoever she asked, beside that which Solomon gave her of his royal bounty. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. We have here an account of the visit which the Queen of Sheba made to Solomon, no doubt when he was in the height of his piety and prosperity. Our Savior calls her the Queen of the South, for Sheba lay south of Canaan. The common opinion is that it was in Africa, and the Christians in Ethiopia, to this day, are confident that she came from their country, and that Candace was her successor, who is mentioned Acts 8 verse 27. But it is more probable that she came from the south part of Arabia the Happy. It should seem she was a queen regent, sovereign of her country. Many a kingdom would have been deprived of its greatest blessings, if a Salic law had been admitted into its constitution. Observe. On what errand the Queen of Sheba came not to treat of trade or commerce, to adjust the limits of their dominions, to court his alliance for their mutual strength, or his assistance against some common enemy, which are the common occasions of the Congress of Crowned Heads and their interviews, but she came, 1. To satisfy her curiosity, for she had heard of his fame, especially for wisdom, and she came to prove him, whether he was so great a man as he was reported to be. Verse 1. Solomon's fleet sailed near the coast of her country, and probably might put in there for fresh water. Perhaps it was thus that she heard of the fame of Solomon, that he excelled in wisdom all the children of the East, and nothing would serve her, but she would go herself and know the truth of the report. 2. To receive instruction from him. She came to hear his wisdom, and thereby to improve her own, Matthew 12 verse 42, that she might be the better able to govern her own kingdom by his maxims of policy. Those whom God has called to any public employment, particularly in the magistracy and ministry, should, by all means possible, be still improving themselves in that knowledge which will more and more qualify them for it, and enable them to discharge their trust well. But it should seem that which she chiefly aimed at was to be instructed in the things of God. She was religiously inclined, and had heard not only of the fame of Solomon, but concerning the name of the Lord. Verse 1, the great name of that God whom Solomon worshipped and from whom he received his wisdom, and with this God she desired to be better acquainted. Therefore does our Savior mention her inquiries after God by Solomon, as an aggravation of the stupidity of those who inquire not after God by our Lord Jesus Christ, though he, having lain in his bosom, was much better able to instruct them. 2. With what equipage she came, with a very great retinue, agreeable to her rank, intending to try Solomon's wealth and generosity, as well as his wisdom, what entertainment he could and would give to a royal visitant. Verse 2. Yet she came not as one begging, but brought enough to bear her charges, and abundantly to recompense Solomon for his attention to her, nothing mean or common, but gold, and precious stones, and spices, because she came to trade for wisdom, which she would purchase at any rate. 3. What entertainment Solomon gave her. He despised not the weakness of her sex, blamed her not for leaving her own business at home to come so long a journey, and put herself and him to so much trouble and expense merely to satisfy her curiosity, but he made her welcome, and all her train, gave her liberty to put all her questions, though some perhaps were frivolous, some captious, and some over-curious. He allowed her to commune with him of all that was in her heart. Verse 2, and gave her a satisfactory answer to all her questions. Verse 3, whether natural, moral, political, or divine. Were they designed to try him? He gave them such turns as abundantly satisfied her of his uncommon knowledge. Were they designed for her own instruction? As we suppose most of them were, she received abundant instruction from him, and he made things surprisingly easy which she apprehended insuperably difficult, and satisfied her that there was a divine sentence in the lips of this king. But he informed her no doubt, with particular care, concerning God and his law and instituted worship. He had taken it for granted, chapter 8:42, that strangers would hear of his great name, and would come thither to inquire after him, and now that so great a stranger came we may be sure he was not wanting to assist and encourage her inquiries, and give her a description of the temple, and the officers and services of it, that she might be persuaded to serve the Lord whom she now sought. For, how she was affected with what she saw and heard in Solomon's court. Diverse things are here mentioned which she admired, the buildings and furniture of his palace, the provision that was made very day for his table. When she saw that, perhaps she wondered where there were mouths for all that meat, but when she saw the multitude of his attendants and guests she was as ready to wonder where was the meat for all those mouths, the orderly sitting of his servants, every one in his place, and the ready attendance of his ministers, without any confusion, their rich liveries, and the propriety with which his cup-bearers waited at his table. These things she admired, as adding much to his magnificence. But, above all these, the first thing mentioned, which contained all, is his wisdom, verse 4, of the transcendency of which she now had incontestable proofs, and the last thing mentioned, which crowned all, is his piety, the ascent by which he went up to the house of the Lord, with what gravity and seriousness, and an air of devotion in his countenance, he appeared, when he went to the temple to worship God, with as much humility than his majesty at other times. Many of the ancient versions read it. The burnt offerings which he offered in the house of the Lord, she observed with what a generous bounty he brought his sacrifices, and with what a pious fervor he attended the offering of them. Never did she see so much goodness with so much greatness. Everything was so surprising that there was no more spirit in her, but she stood amazed, she had never seen the like. 5. How she expressed herself upon this occasion. 1. She owned her expectation far outdone, though it was highly raised by the report she heard, verses 6 and 7. She is far from repenting her journey or calling herself a fool for undertaking it, but acknowledges it was well worth her while to come so far for the sight of that which she could not believe the report of. Usually things are represented to us, both by common fame and by our own imagination, much greater than we find them when we come to examine them, but here the truth exceeded both fame and fancy. Those who, through grace, are brought to experience the delights of communion with God will say that the one half was not told them of the pleasures of wisdom's ways and the advantages of her gates. Glorified saints, much more, will say that it was a true report which they heard of the happiness of heaven, but that the thousandth part was not told them. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 9. 2. She pronounced those happy that constantly attended him, and waited on him at table. Happy are thy men, happy are these thy servants. Verse 8. They may improve their own wisdom by hearing thine. She was tempted to envy them, and to witch herself one of them. Note, it is a great advantage to be in good families, and to have opportunity of frequent converse with those that are wise and good and communicative. Many have this happiness who know not how to value it. With much more reason may we say this of Christ's servants: blessed are those that dwell in his house, they will be still praising him. 3. She blessed God, the giver of Solomon's wisdom and wealth, and the author of his advancement, who had made him king. 1. In kindness to him, that he might have the larger opportunity of doing good with his wisdom, he delighted in thee, to set thee on the throne of Israel. Verse 9. Solomon's preferment began in the prophets calling him Jedediah, because the Lord loved him. 2 Samuel 12 verse 25. It more than doubles our comforts if we have reason to hope they come from God's delight in us. It was his pleasure concerning thee, so it may be read, to set thee on the throne, not for thy merit's sake, but because it so seemed good unto him. 2. In kindness to the people, because the Lord loved Israel forever, designed them a lasting bliss, longed to survive him that laid the foundations of it. He has made thee king, not that thou mayest live in pomp and pleasure, and do what thou wilt, but to do judgment and justice. This she kindly reminded Solomon of, and no doubt he took it kindly. Both magistrates and ministers must be more solicitous to do the duty of their places than to secure the honors and profits of them. To this she attributes his prosperity, not to his wisdom, for bread is not always to the wise. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 11. But whoso doeth judgment and justice, it shall be well with him. Jeremiah 22 verse 15. Thus giving of thanks must be made for kings, for good kings, for such kings, they are what God makes them to be. 6. How they parted. 1. She made a noble present to Solomon of gold and spices. Verse 10. David had foretold concerning Solomon that to him should be given of the gold of Sheba. Psalm 72 verse 15. The present of gold and spices which the wise men of the East brought to Christ was signified by this. Matthew 2 verse 11. Thus she paid for the wisdom she had learned and did not think she bought it dearly. Let those that are taught of God give him their hearts, and the present will be more acceptable than this of gold and spices. Mention is made of the great abundance Solomon had of his own, notwithstanding she presented, and he accepted this gold. What we present to Christ he needs not, but will have us so to express our gratitude. The almond trees are here spoken of, verses 11 and 12, as extraordinary, because perhaps much admired by the Queen of Sheba. 2. Solomon was not behindhand with her, he gave her whatsoever she asked, patterns, we may suppose, of those things that were curious, by which she might make the like, or perhaps he gave her his precepts of wisdom and piety in writing, besides that which he gave her of his royal bounty. Verse 13. Thus those who apply to our Lord Jesus will find him not only greater than Solomon and wiser, but more kind. Whatsoever we ask, it shall be done for us, nay, he will, out of his divine bounty, which infinitely exceeds royal bounty, even Solomon's, do for us more than we are able to ask or think. Solomon's wealth, 990 BC. 14. Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. 15. Beside that he had of the merchantmen, and of the traffic of the spice merchants, and of all the kings of Arabia, and of the governors of the country. 16. And King Solomon made 200 targets of beaten gold, 600 shekels of gold went to one target. 17. And he made 300 shields of beaten gold, 3 pound of gold went to one shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. 18 Moreover the king made a great throne of ivory, and overlaid it with the best gold. 19 The throne had 6 steps, and the top of the throne was round behind, and there were stays on either side on the place of the seat, and 2 lions stood beside the stays. 20 And 12 lions stood there on the one side and on the other upon the 6 steps, there was not the like made in any kingdom. 21 And all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold, none were of silver. It was nothing accounted of in the days of Solomon. 22 For the king had at sea a navy of Tharshish with the navy of Hiram. Once in 3 years came the navy of Tharshish, bringing gold, and silver, ivory, and apes, and peacocks. 23 So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and for wisdom. 24 And all the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. 25 And they brought every man his present, vessels of silver, and vessels of gold, and garments, and armor, and spices, horses, and mules, a rate year by year. 26 And Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots, and 12,000 horsemen, whom he bestowed in the cities for chariots, and with the king at Jerusalem. 27 And the king made silver to be in Jerusalem as stones, and cedars made he to be as the sycamore trees that are in the vale, for abundance. 28 And Solomon had horses brought out of Egypt, and linen yarn. The king's merchants received the linen yarn at a price. 29 And a chariot came up and went out of Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150, and so for all the kings of the Hittites, and for the kings of Syria, did they bring them out by their means. We have here a further account of Solomon's prosperity. 1. How he increased his wealth. Though he had much, he still coveted to have more, being willing to try the utmost the things of this world could do to make men happy. 1. Besides the gold that came from Ophir, chapter 9 verse 28, he brought so much into his country from other places that the whole amounted, every year, to 666 talents, verse 14, an ominous number, compare Revelation 13 verse 18 and Ezra 2 verse 13. 2. He received a great deal in customs from the merchants, and in land taxes from the countries his father had conquered and made tributaries to Israel, verse 15. 3. He was Hiram's partner in a Tharshish fleet of and for Tyre, which imported once in 3 years, not only gold, and silver, and ivory, substantial goods and serviceable, but apes to play with and peacocks to please the eye with their feathers, verse 22. I wish this may not be an evidence that Solomon and his people, being overcharged with prosperity, by this time grew childish and wanton. 4. He had presents made him, every year, from the neighboring princes and great men, to engage the continuance of his friendship, not so much because they feared him, or were jealous of him as because they loved him and admired his wisdom, had often occasion to consult him as an oracle, and sent him these presents by way of recompense for his advice in politics, and, whether it became his grandeur and generosity or no we will not inquire, he took all that came, even garments and spices, horses and mules, verses 24 and 25. 5. He traded to Egypt for horses and linen yarn, or, as some read it, linen cloth, the staple commodities of that country, and had his own merchants or factors whom he employed in this traffic, and who were accountable to him, verse 28 and 29. The custom to be paid to the king of Egypt for exported chariots and horses out of Egypt was very high, but, as Bishop Patrick understands it, Solomon, having married his daughter, got him to compound for the customs, so that he could bring them up cheaper than his neighbors, which obliged them to buy them of him, which he was wise enough no doubt to make his advantage of. This puts an honor upon the trading part of a nation, and sets a tradesman not so much below a gentleman as some place him, that Solomon, one of the greatest men that ever was, thought it no disparagement to him to deal in trade. In all labor there is profit. 2. Which is he made of his wealth? He did not hoard it up in his coffers, that he might have it to look upon and leave behind him. He has, in his Ecclesiastes, so much exposed the folly of hoarding that we cannot suppose he would himself be guilty of it. No, God that had given him riches and wealth and honor, gave him also power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, Ecclesiastes 5, 19. 1. He laid out his gold and fine things for himself, which he might the better be allowed to do when he had before laid out so much in fine things for the house of God. 1. He made 200 targets and 300 shields, of beaten gold, verses 16 and 17, not for service, but for state, to be carried before him when he appeared in pomp. With us, magistrates have swords and maces carried before them, as the Romans had their rods and axes, in token of their power to correct and punish the bad, to whom they are to be a terror. But Solomon had shields and targets carried before him, to signify that he took more pleasure in using his power for the defense and protection of the good to whom he would be a praise. Magistrates are shields of the earth. 2. He made a stately throne, on which he sat, to give laws to his subjects, audience to ambassadors, and judgment upon appeals, verses 18 to 20. It was made of ivory or elephant's teeth, which was very rich, and yet, as if he had so much gold that he knew not what to do with it, he overlaid that with gold, the best gold. Yet some think he did not cover the ivory all over, but here and there. He rolled it, floured it, or inlaid it, with gold. The stays or arms of this stately chair were supported by the images of lions in gold, so were the steps and paces by which he went up to it, to be a memorandum to him of that courage and resolution wherewith he ought to execute judgment, not fearing the face of man. The righteous in that post is bold as a lion. 3. He made all his drinking vessels, and all the furniture of his table, even at his country seat, of pure gold, verse 21. He did not grudge himself what he had, but took the credit and comfort of it, such as it was. That is good that does us good. 2. He made it circulate among his subjects, so that the kingdom was as rich as the king, for he had no separate interests of his own to consult, but sought the welfare of his people. Those princes are not governed by Solomon's maxims, who think it policy to keep their subjects poor. Solomon was herein a type of Christ, who is not only rich himself, but enriches all that are his. Solomon was instrumental to bring so much gold into the country, and disperse it, that silver was nothing accounted of, verse 21. There was such plenty of it in Jerusalem that it was as the stones and cedars, that used to be great rarities, were as common as sycamore trees, verse 27. Such is the nature of worldly wealth, plenty of it makes it the less valuable. Much more should the enjoyment of spiritual riches lessen our esteem of all earthly possessions. If gold in abundance would make silver to seem so despicable, shall not wisdom and grace, and the foretastes of heaven, which are far better than gold, make earthly wealth seem much more despicable? Lastly, thus rich, thus great, was Solomon, and thus did he exceed all the kings of the earth, verse 23. Now let us remember, 1. That this was he who, when he was setting out in the world, did not ask for the wealth and honor of it, but asked for a wise and understanding heart. The more moderate our desires are towards earthly things, the better qualified we are for the enjoyment of them, and the more likely to have them. See, in Solomon's greatness, the performance of God's promise, chapter 3 verse 13, and let it encourage us to seek first the righteousness of God's kingdom. 2. That this was he who, having tasted all these enjoyments, wrote a whole book to show the vanity of all worldly things, and the vexation of spirit that attends them, their insufficiency to make us happy, and the folly of setting our hearts upon them, and to recommend to us the practice of serious godliness, as that which is the whole of man, and will do infinitely more towards the making of us easy and happy than all the wealth and power that he was master of, and which, through the grace of God, is within our reach, when the 1,000th part of Solomon's greatness is 1,000 times more than we can ever be so vain as to promise ourselves in this world.